All right. So we're diving in to something that I know a lot of you have been struggling with. And, that's the whole Fib 7 launch debacle and all
Yeah.
those crashing issues that people have been having.
Hmm.
Our listener wrote in and, they were super psyched to get the game. They were ready to go, build their empire and everything. And bam, the game just crashes
Oh, yeah.
right out of the gate.
Yep.
They tried everything.
Oh, I bet.
They even tried switching, from DirectX 12 to Vulkan, which, by the way, for listeners who aren't super techie, that's kind of like choosing between, two different sets of instructions for how your graphics card should talk to the game.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's a pretty fundamental thing. And, they still had issues, and they're seeing all over the place online, people hitting that same wall. And so the question is this just bad luck? Or is this kind of like a sign of the times? Are we seeing this more often with game launches these days?
Hmm.
So we're going to deep dive into, the listeners' notes, what they went through. I've got some other gamers' experiences as well. And we're going to try to make sense of it all with our expert here.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think you've hit on something that a lot of gamers are calling right now, and it's a real frustration. I mean, remember the days when day one patches were like a rare thing?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there's a day one patch now. It's almost like we expect it.
Right.
It's almost like we're paying full price for a beta test these days.
Yeah. That's exactly what it feels like. And I mean, you mentioned how different it was like a couple decades ago. Was it really smoother back then? Or is this just like our rose-tinted glasses talking?
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple things to consider here, right? Like, one, games back then were just on a completely different scale.
Mm-hmm.
You think about the games we had back then, a lot of them could fit on a couple of floppy disks,
Yeah.
Now we're talking about these massive, sprawling worlds, huge detailed environments,
Right.
complex AI, online and multiplayer, all this stuff happening behind the scenes, and that all translates to millions of lines of code.
Right.
And even a tiny error somewhere in there can cascade into some massive problem,
Yeah.
like the crashes that you're seeing. And also think about the technology landscape. Back then, you basically had like one type of PC setup to worry about,
Mm-hmm.
Now there's this huge range of hardware operating systems, drivers, graphics cards.
Yeah.
It's a nightmare for developers to try and test every single combination.
Yeah, you basically have to build a small server farm just to be able to test across all these kind of combinations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, in our listeners' case, they were doing everything right. They checked their specs. They were even, trying to tweak the graphic settings, switching over to Vulkan. But as they found out, just meeting those minimum requirements doesn't guarantee a smooth experience. So what's the deal with that?
Yeah, and that really comes down to something called optimization.
Okay.
And it's like the difference between having a really powerful engine in your car and actually knowing how to, drive it efficiently.
Okay.
A game might technically run on your system. If it's poorly optimized, it's not going to run well.
Gotcha.
And the problem is that optimization often happens at the very end of the development cycle.
Oh, so they kind of tack it on at the end?
Yeah, developers are focused on getting all the features in and working, and then, almost as an afterthought, it's like, okay, now we got to make sure it runs smoothly.
Oh,
And
wow.
sometimes they just run out of time before it launches.
So it's really a time crunch thing?
Yeah, a lot of the time.
Okay, so our listener ended up returning the game. They decided to wait for patches, which, I'm seeing more and more these days. Is that a smart move? I mean, on one hand, it seems like it's, forcing developers to fix things faster.
Right.
But are we creating other problems down the line by doing that?
It's a tough one. It's a double-edged sword.
Okay.
Because, on the one hand, it puts pressure on the developers to patch things quickly, but on the other hand, it can create this kind of vicious cycle.
Okay.
Publishers see that players are willing to wait for a finished product, so they're more likely to push for release, even if the game's not quite there yet.
Right.
It's like, well, they'll buy it anyway. They'll wait for the patches, and we'll just, push it out.
It's almost like they're thinking it's okay if it's broken on release.
Yeah, and especially for smaller studios, I think this can be really dangerous.
Oh, how so?
But, they really need those initial sales to keep the lights on.
Mm-hmm.
And if everyone's waiting for a patched version, they might not make it.
They might not survive long enough to even get the patches out.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a tough situation all around.
Okay, so I think the big question that's on everyone's mind is this just laziness on the part of the developers? Like, do they just not care anymore?
I get it. It's easy to feel that way, especially when you're dealing with a buggy mess of a game.
Yeah.
But you got to remember that game dev is incredibly complex.
Yeah.
It's really demanding, and there's a lot of external pressures too.
Right.
You've got publishers breathing down their necks, setting deadlines. You've got marketing campaigns generating all this hype.
Right.
Everyone's trying to hit certain financial targets, and often the developers are kind of caught in the middle,
Right.
trying to make the best game they can while also dealing with these crazy time constraints.
So it's not just, sitting around in their basement, eating pizza and coding.
Right, exactly. It's way more than that.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. It's not as simple as just lazy devs.
Yeah, it's this whole web of factors, the growing complexity of games, the constantly changing technology landscape,
Mhm.
the pressures of the industry, and it all kind of leads to this question, what can we as consumers do about this?
Right.
Because we do have a lot of power, do we pre-order games? Do we buy them day one and risk running into these issues? Or do we wait for reviews, wait for patches, maybe send a message that quality is really important?
Right, because all those things affect, the sales figures that the publishers are looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. Our choices have a real impact.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, I think that's something for all of us to consider, as we go forward with our gaming purchases and everything. So thank you so much for diving into all this with us. It's been a really eye-opening conversation.
My pleasure.
And I'm sure it's given our listener and all our listeners out there a lot to think about.
I hope so.
So until next time, happy and hopefully crash-free gaming, everyone.
Absolutely.
We'll see you next time.
Sounds good. TTS.